Welcome to the Invisible to Visible podcast, where we are unearthing the truths of human trafficking and beyond. My name is Charlie, and in this episode we will be discussing why we should care about human trafficking.
Hi, I'm Kira, and I'm going to be interviewing Megan. So, can you start off with telling us what human trafficking is?
Okay, so human trafficking is the movement, coercion and exploitation of people for profit. What that means is movement's a very easy word to understand, so moving one person from one location to another, and that might be from Ballymena to Belfast, it could be from Ballymena to Bangladesh. The amount of movement doesn't matter, it just matters that there is movement. And then coercion is how somebody is manipulated or forced into doing something they don't want to do. And then exploitation is the person actually doing the thing they don't want to do. So human trafficking is the movement, coercion and exploitation of people for profit. But the profit never goes to the person that's being exploited. It always goes to the trafficker.
Why might someone be trafficked?
That's a really good question, Kira. Basically, people get trafficked for a whole range of reasons. One of these might be because they are an easy target to a trafficker. A trafficker's seen that this person's particularly vulnerable or at risk because they maybe don't have a lot of money. So they've promised them a job that doesn't exist, or promised them, something that they would want, or they know the person, they know their family, they know they can't provide the newest phone or nice trainers or whatever, and they'll say, oh, I can give you those trainers, this phone. All you need to do is do, this job for me. But it could also just be someone who is maybe experiencing homelessness, someone who is really just down on their luck as well. Traffickers are always going to look for low-hanging fruit. They're going to look for the easiest person to exploit and traffic, which is horrible to think of it that way. But they'll always think, how can I make the most money out of my product? And the product is people.
What would you say some of the benefits are for us gaining knowledge about what human trafficking is?
I think the big thing is, in the programme, in the Invisible to Visible project, this programme that me and Erin deliver and facilitate, we're always trying to think about how to keep young people safe. So how do we keep entire communities safe? How do we keep families safe? And how do we keep young people safe? And we think about, that individual young person when we equip and empower one young person with knowledge, all of their little arena, all the people around them can actually be empowered as well, because they're going to share that knowledge and education with all of those different people in their circle. And then when we're actually empowering those individuals and they're spreading it with their circle, and we're then telling parents or adults around these young people, how to keep this young person safe, or to talk about human trafficking, making them aware of it, then we actually are safeguarding entire communities. So when we are safeguarding entire communities, then we can actually make Northern Ireland a really hostile place for traffickers. And they'll think, flip, this is the place. This isn't a place where we can easily traffic people. This is actually quite a hard place to traffic people. So maybe we need to move our business elsewhere. And then we actually, trafficking will be so much easier to pinpoint, and the police can actually then follow through and arrest those different people when we make it a hostile place.
How close would you say human trafficking is actually to us?
Oh, that's again a great question, Kira. Human trafficking, is so much more prevalent than we have even understood. People think human trafficking is an out there issue. In the world, there's over 50 million slaves in the world today. And that isn't, that we would say that isn't the full figure. We don't even know. There's all these different places across the world that are hidden where people are being trafficked, or maybe trafficking in a certain way hasn't been identified. So when we think about young people in Northern Ireland, for example, people would think, oh, they're not trafficked. But there's ways that young people are trafficked in Northern Ireland, and there's things that have happened to young people in Northern Ireland that would count as trafficking. In the UK, the data tells us there's over 136,000 people who are trafficked or enslaved in the UK today. Again, that's the tip of the iceberg number. We know that there is more people enslaved than that, because the recording mechanisms that measure, how many people have been trafficked, exploited, enslaved in the UK the data is not representative of Northern Ireland. We don't have enough people referred to the National Referral Mechanism, which is basically how victims are identified. We have this process where a first responder would fill in an NRM form, a National Referral Mechanism form, and that goes off to the Home Office. The Home Office decides whether that person is, yep, they're a victim, or no, they're not a victim, and then, why they've given that decision. Then that person gets support in different ways and means if they have victim status. And, those figures, we only had 651 people referred to the National Referral Mechanism in 2024. But we know there's so many more people that are actually being exploited and trafficked in Northern Ireland that is beyond that number, So the figures only tell us so much. So trafficking is closer than we think. If we think about organised criminal gangs and paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, we know that they are exploiting people. They're exploiting vulnerabilities. They're moving people. They're forcing them to do things they don't want to do. And all those things can make up human trafficking. So it's a lot closer than we think, and it is happening in our towns and in our cities in Northern Ireland. And it could be happening to people that we maybe know or pass on the street,
If you could tell someone watching, listening to this podcast, if you could tell them one piece of advice of what to look out for, what would you tell them?
That's a really hard question. Let me just think for a wee second. I think if something seems too good to be true, generally it is, especially for young people. When we think about somebody that's offering the solution, the catch-all solution to our problems, that kind of in Aladdin where he rubs the lamp and the genie grants 3 wishes. If somebody's promising to grant your wishes, that's the type of person that maybe is wanting to see what our vulnerabilities are, and they're wanting to then use us and exploit us. I'm going to add to my one piece of advice is, if somebody is promising that catch-all, or this will solve all your problems, or you need money, we can provide you with money. If they're offering that, then tell someone, especially if you're a young person who is, try and figure out, okay, who can I trust? What adults around me can I trust? Is there a teacher? Is there a youth worker? Is there a social worker? Is there, a parent or an aunt or whoever it is? Find those trusted adults in your life and cling on to them. I know I'm an adult, and I say this all the time to young people, I'm an adult and I've trusted adults around me, because they actually help and support us and make sure, that we're safe. And this is why it's so important to know who your trusted adults are. So when someone offers you this, golden ticket, or this moment, or this kind of catch-all thing to solve all your problems, then you can actually say, I don't think that sounds too good to be true, because it is too good to be true. And I'm going to tell someone that this person's offered me this solution to all my problems. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Megan, I would actually like to ask you a question.
Okay, go ahead.
How are paramilitaries connected to human trafficking?
Yes, so as I was saying to Kira, paramilitaries are connected in a number of ways, and we can call them paramilitary groups or organised criminal gangs. Same difference in my mind, to be honest. A lot of the time, it's how they would encourage, and by encourage I mean coerce, young people into different activity. So it could be young people who are maybe being exploited into riotous behaviour in different contexts, young people being exploited into moving or transporting drugs. And a lot of these paramilitary groups, that's where they're finding their status and their power, is through the movement of drugs and dealing of drugs. And then they will then use, an easy asset, which is a young person. So they could promise them, I've had young people I've worked with who have shown up with nice watch, nice, trainers, new tracksuit, and all this expensive gear. And you're thinking, how are you getting all this expensive stuff? And the question doesn't need to, you can explore a little bit and you actually can see then, oh my goodness, they're being exploited and they're being given little bits of money. Like if you think about somebody who's transporting drugs, it's worth maybe £8,000 and they're getting given £500. They think, flip me, I've been given £500. I've never experienced like having £500 cash in my hand before in my life. And now I've actually been given this. That young person, is just so vulnerable and susceptible to exploitation because that paramilitary knows they've never experienced that £500 in their hands. So you find that, young people are the easy way in for paramilitaries to then use and pull the little strings like a puppet string, like a puppet master. They'll just pull the strings and say, look, you're going to go to this place and collect this package. And once that young person says, actually, I don't want to do this anymore. Did you think you had a choice? You don't have a choice here. I'm in control. And they'll be sent to wherever they deem necessary. So it might be, to cuckoo a house, which just means to take over a house and to deal drugs from that house. And usually the person that they've cuckooed a house off is an extremely vulnerable person. They might be someone who uses drugs. It might be somebody who is, very, very vulnerable. And they'll take over the property and they'll be selling drugs from that property. So lots of different things can happen with young people and paramilitaries. And they're, even when we think about older people, or people who have disabilities as well, we've seen reports of paramilitaries basically using. There was a guy, they used his house, they hid weapons in his wall behind drywall, and that's also exploiting him. That is actually forcing him into criminality because he then gets arrested for possession of arms when actually he's being instructed and told, or maybe not even told. Maybe there's a family member who's gone into the house and has hid the weapons in the wall and plastered the wall, but this vulnerable person hasn't seen that. So there's a lot of people that are just used as fodder for human trafficking and for exploitation to further the agenda of these paramilitary groups.
So we've spoken a little bit about forced criminality, but what are all the other types of human trafficking?
Great question, Charlie. There's 6 different types of trafficking in total. So, and I sound really, I need to make it clear for people listening. I say these very matter-of-factly, and then people are always a bit jarred when I'm saying something horrendous, and they're like, what? But we talked about forced criminality, which is obviously forcing people into crimes. There's forced labour, which is people being forced into different work that they're, not wanting to do, or maybe they thought they'd have a legitimate job, and it's turned out that their wages are taken off them at the end of the month. And these can be, jobs that they have the right to do, and they are employed to do. But a trafficker will just take their wages. And that happens a lot more often than you would think. Somebody could be forced into marriage. So forced marriage is something that is definitely on the rise in the island of Ireland, especially within like Gypsy Traveller community. I've heard of a couple of cases of young women who have been forced into marriages, but across the world, forced marriage is happening to girls as young as 9. And it is happening to young men too, and that's something that we need to be aware of. So that's somebody who's obviously forced into a marriage. Generally, like I said, it's girls. So as soon as girls reach the age where they have a period and they can reproduce, they'll be sold off and married to somebody who, can pay a good hefty price for them. Then there is domestic servitude, which is somebody who is a domestic, so that means home, so a servant within the home. They might be forced to cook and clean, nanny, look after children. We've had 3 cases of this in East Belfast over the past couple of years. It's really interesting because one of the girls got rescued because she was in church, and actually she was allowed, her trafficker allowed her, or the people that were, owning her, allowed her to go to church, and then she actually confided in somebody and says, look, this was happening to me. But these were people that were dropping kids off at the school gate, but not able to tell anybody what was happening, because their trafficker had so much control over even like that mental control too, and that kind of that pull that was happening mentally for those people. And then we have sexual exploitation, which is where somebody is forced to do sexual acts that they don't want to do. And that can happen online, that can happen in person, that can happen to adults, that can happen to children. And it's very expansive and diverse, and really what people would think when you say the word human trafficking or slavery, people will think about, forced sex work, and they'll think about things like that. And that's where their head will go to. Generally, when I'm talking to people trafficking, that's where their head goes to first. But that is one of 6 types, like I said. And the final type is organ harvesting. I think have I said 6 types? Hang on. Forced criminality, forced marriage, forced labour, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation. Yep. The final one is organ harvesting. So that is one that is pretty brutal in its name, and it is what it says it is. It's taking someone's organs without their consent. Generally, what that looks like is somebody getting their kidney taken a lot of the time. There's been one case of that that's led to a prosecution in the UK, one big case. We don't have examples of that leading to prosecution in Northern Ireland, but we know that there have been, I've heard, kind of rumours, but I've heard from women, a couple of different women, that there's been a couple of women from Belfast who have went to get weight loss surgery in Turkey and came back missing a kidney. And they haven't, I think one of them received remuneration from the surgeon. But, you hear stories of, like, horror stories of people who are getting sick somewhere on holiday, and an autopsy happens, and they're actually missing organs. And you're thinking, did they actually die, or were they killed for their organs? Because it's a big market on the dark web for the trafficking of organs. So people can be trafficked for that purpose. So the big case happened in the UK. A guy was brought over from Lagos, and essentially this really powerful man in the UK had a daughter who needed a kidney. He had a guy that he knew who was a medical middleman. He was a doctor who had performed, who had got a kidney himself through organ harvesting. So he says, yep, I've done this before, I can do this for your daughter. So brought over this guy from Lagos. They pretended that they were cousins, so the family took photos of him and the girl together. They took him to this private hospital in London, because when you think of things like organ harvesting, you think about dingy, back alley kind of operations, but actually people are paying big money. So a kidney, getting a kidney through organ harvesting can cost up to $200,000 because of all these different people that have to be involved. So they're in this private hospital in London, and they have to do a psychological evaluation before you donate an organ. And the doctors realised that everything wasn't right here. And then what happened was they took this man back to the place where they were holding him, and he overheard a conversation where they were saying, don't worry, we'll go back to Nigeria, we'll do the operation there, we'll get it all sorted there. And he ran away and managed to find a police station and managed to tell them what had happened. But yeah, and that case led to the father of the girl being in prison for 10 years. The medical middleman got 10 years, and the mum, I think she got 5 or 8 years, can't remember. But the daughter apparently didn't know. So that's something that is happening in our country that we're not even aware of, really. Because every time I mention organ harvesting to people, it's met with a very shocked response. So those are the 6 different types, just to give you a rundown.
Thank you, Megan, for having the chat with us and answering all the questions.
No problem. Thank you so much.
That was a really interesting chat. What are your thoughts on it, Charlie?
I found it really interesting was when Megan was talking about organ harvesting. I've spoken with her about it before, and we discussed how 10% globally, 10% of all organs used in transplants are obtained illegally. They're trafficked organs, which is a crazy statistic to think about. What about you?
I think the main thing I took away was just how many different types of human trafficking there is in the world.
Yeah, Kira, that's right. And it's really interesting. Thanks very much for listening to the Invisible to Visible podcast.